Welcome back to part 3. So we are going to continue on our property training. So let's go back into Firefox, and you can see here that I've created a new page. And if we go into Text Expander, we'll see that I've created a div with an ID of container. This is very common maybe if you're building a website, that maybe a website with a fixed width, which is pretty common these days. You'll have it wrapped all within one big div with an ID of container or wrap or content wrap, anything. Now within it, I have created a heading 2 tag, h2, and a paragraph, and that's it. So we're going to learn about typography. So once again, I'm going to go to CSS, edit CSS, or hit Shift Command E if you're working along. So we can target, let's first talk about how to target each of these elements specifically. If we want to target all paragraphs, we can do P. Now if we want to target all heading 2 tags, similarly, we type H2, and that'll find all H2s on the page and style them accordingly. Cool. Now the next step is we can actually apply broader, so we don't always have to be as specific as possible. If we want, we can apply the base font not to the paragraph, because then we would have to set font family. Here's a new property, font family Helvetica. We would have to apply that to the heading tag too. So H1, H2, font family Helvetica. Okay, so that's a lot of work, right, to change it. Now we have a couple solutions. One of them is we can target multiple selectors. This is called a selector. Now we can do a comma and create another selector, H2. And now if I get rid of this, it's targeted, but that still isn't smart enough because we would have to do this for all of our fonts. That's just a huge waste of time. What if we just do the body element, the wrapping parent element for everything, and now we can set font family Helvetica. Now it works, and that's going to be applied to all text unless something more specific overrides it, and we'll talk about that shortly. But we have one more problem here. What if the user doesn't have Helvetica installed on their computer? On a Mac, it's pretty common. On PCs, maybe not, especially depending on how old the computer is. So what does the browser do? In those cases, the browser will default back to its default style sheet. So let's get rid of all styling for this page. Note that, how is this text bold? Where does this spacing come from? Where you see around the heading, all around the window, there's this little bit of spacing. If I can make this smaller, can you see all the way to the right here? There's just this built-in spacing. Where's that coming from? If the CSS is responsible for all styling of the page, why does it seem like there already is some built in? And it's because there is. Browsers by default have a default style sheet that adds a base styling. So it knows that in general, heading tags are probably going to be bold and of different sizes. It knows that there's going to be some margins by default for all paragraphs. That way, if we add another paragraph, save it, refresh the page, it knows that if it's a new paragraph, there needs to be some spacing or a margin between the paragraphs. It knows that the body element needs to receive some kind of padding or margin by default. So the problem is, and it's not a huge problem, some people think it's bigger than it is, but the problem is not all browsers do this 100% the same. Now with modern browsers, you can be a little more confident, but especially with older browsers, they do things slightly different. While one browser might have applied 10 pixels of margin left, another one would apply 20 pixels, and that can really mess up your design. So what a lot of people do is they insist on using what they call a reset style sheet. Now, we're not going to get into that just yet in this series, but what a reset basically does is it zeroes out all of the styling that the browser adds. And the thinking is, I want to be in control of my page, and I don't want the browser to do any thinking for me. Okay, we're not going to get into that just yet, but keep that in the back of your mind that a browser adds default styling. So for instance, the browser for H2 tags is assuming that the font weight, here's a new property, we had font family, now font weight is bold. That's just implied, and we don't even have to add it. But if we wanted to bring it back to just the regular, not bold, you set normal. Okay, and now you see how the font size is there? We can change font size, and we can make this anything we want. In general, heading tags are going to be a little bit larger. We could do 18 pixels. We could do, I think that one might have been 24 pixels that the browser uses. You can do as big as you want depending on your project. 72, okay? So we have font, and you know what, I'm going to keep font family in here just to see all of the different values. Now, if we set margin bottom to 0, you're going to see that pop up, and it's because the browser is adding that. So why people use resets is maybe they don't know off the top of their head everything that's being applied, and they don't want to have to try to figure out, okay, where's that space coming from? Is it a margin? Is it padding? What is the browser doing? They want to know 100% that they are controlling it. So think about that in the back of your mind, and maybe when we get into future lessons, you'll see the advantage to using a reset file. It's very debated though. So I'm going to get rid of this, and let's continue with font. So we can set a line height. So let's go into our paragraphs, and if we want, we can set a line height, and I'm going to set it something really tall. And as you would imagine, this is the height for each line is 50 pixels. Okay. Now if we want to set it, if we know that our font size for our paragraphs is maybe 15 pixels, something like that. The base font size that the defaults add, that the browsers add, is usually 16. So we can set a line height, usually maybe 1.4 times that. So why don't we set it to, I don't know, 22 pixels? And that looks pretty good. You don't want to get too high or it becomes too much, but you can play around with it. Now, in addition to pixels, we can use something called ems. Now, I don't want to get into that just yet, but we could do 1.4 ems, and that's actually the height of the letter M. So I don't want to get into that just yet, but know that there are different ways to specify values than just pixels. You can use something ems. There's quite a few, actually. We'll stick with pixels, and I'm going to go back to 24 pixels. Okay, so you've learned font family, font weight, font size. We have another one called letter spacing. Letter spacing. And let's set 5 pixels. And this is the spacing between every single letter. So by default, it would just be 0. But if we wanted to set it something really high, you can do a lot there. Now, you can even set negative numbers. In 2009, it was really popular. People did -1 pixel to kind of push it close together, as you can see there. You might be able to see that a little more prevalent in the paragraph. Like that. That was pretty popular. I'm not a huge fan of that, but you can set -10. You can ruin your layout if you want. Yeah, that's not even going to work. But let's set letter spacing to 1 pixel. Okay, or -1, or bring it back up to the heading tag. So we're learning a lot of stuff here. But wouldn't it be nice if we could group these together so that we don't have to type all these different fonts? And you'll find with CSS, so many of the properties has a shorthand available. So we could do font, just single font, and we can set the font size. We could set the line height. We can set the font family. We can do that all at once. So let's go and set the font size to 25, or let's do it really big, 45 pixels. And we can do a slash, and slash wants to know what the line height is. So I'm going to set it really tall again, 50 pixels, just so you can see the difference. And now we can pass in any of our other values. And we'll set the font size, and I'm going to set that to Helvetica. Or why don't we set something different, Times. Okay, that's going to set that. If we want to change the font size to 75 pixels, that'll do it accordingly. If we want to set the font weight, we can do that at the very beginning if we want. Let's set it to bold. Okay, so now we've set the font to be bold. We want the font size to be 75 pixels. We want the line height to be 50 pixels. We can bring that down if we want. And we want the font family to be Times. So if this is a little hard to remember, you're more than welcome to do font family. And some people do that for years just because it's maybe easier to comprehend, easier to make edits. So one other thing I want to note though is, notice how we set a font size of 75 pixels, but we also set a font size, let's change this for example to 42. So how does the browser know, well, should the font size be 42 pixels or should it be 75 pixels? And this is where kind of the cascade effect also comes into play. The lower it is on the page, all things being equal, the lower thing will take precedence. It'll assume that it's overriding. So if I go and comment this out and I set font family, font size to 10 pixels, you can see that this is overriding what we set here before. If we were to copy this or cut it and move it, now that one's going to take effect, as you can see. So don't worry about these too much. Just do know that whatever is lower on the page, all things being equal, is going to take precedence. Okay. Once again, here we have the weight of the font. It could be normal, it could be bold. We have the font size, we have the line height, and then we have the font family. Now the last thing I want to go over is, I did this a little bit, but Helvetica, if it's not stored on everyone's computer, you need to apply a fallback. Now, as we said, it falls back to whatever the browser has defined by default in its default style sheet. But we need to have control over that, so we can do comma and do a fallback. So if it doesn't have Helvetica, search for Arial. If it doesn't have Arial, search for something else. And then usually you'll fall back to like a serif or a sans serif. And that will, if you don't know much about typography, it's beyond the scope of this series, but it's styles of fonts, the way they're laid out. Okay? And we can go ahead and omit that, and it'll grab whatever by default has been set previously. And that's really it for fonts. You can do a little bit more, but that's the extent of it. A mixture of font size, the weight, the line height, the letter spacing, and then it's just making it look really nice. So once you get your head around this, move on to the next part.